I remember you saying something about doing the right thing.
I don't even know what that means.
I think we should only use our powers for good.
What are we considering good as of 9:06 p.m. tonight? Those two aren't all bad. Saul Goodman is, he's the last line of defense for the little guy. File that under unintended consequences. Justice matters most. La familia es todo. Well, Howard, I guess...
Continue our discussion of the best show on television, Better Call Saul, as we get ready for the final season's release on April 18th. You may have noticed that the first video in this series was titled Better Call Saul, Can People Change? But we didn't actually answer the question of whether people can change and whether Saul can do so. We need to look at how the show understands ethics. So let's do that right now. How about we start with this? You know that famous ethical riddle, the trolley problem? It's the idea that a trolley is about to run over, like, let's say 5 people or something, and you can flip a switch that changes its track so it goes another way and instead only kills 2 people or whatever. Do you flip the switch knowing that you are now responsible for those 2 people's deaths, but also knowing that you saved 5 other people? It's a good demonstration of the conflict between principles and consequences, since our principles tell us we should never do anything that harms people, but here we know that more harm will be done if we do nothing, at least quantitatively, if it even makes sense to talk about harm in that way. But there's one huge reason why ethical decision making in life is different and more complicated than the trolley problem. In the trolley problem, we know exactly what the consequences of our decision will be, but this isn't the case in real life. We can try to predict, but the fact that we need to predict brings in a whole separate set of issues. Our biases can make us miss something in our calculations, and so a decision that may seem unethical from the outside may be partially explained by bad intent and partially explained by bad prediction abilities. In these situations, is the person behaving unethically because they lack a conscience or because they're just more motivated by other drives? And does that difference even matter? Take, for example, one of the biggest ethical conflicts in Better Call Saul, when Jimmy decides to sabotage Chuck's Mesa Verde filing, taking painstaking effort to switch numbers around on documents, delaying Chuck's work significantly, and causing enormous professional embarrassment for him. Jimmy does this to obstruct his brother's work with the big bank client that Jimmy is trying to entice to go back to working with Kim.
He did it for you.
I did it for Kim!
Hurting one person to help another sounds a bit like a trolley problem, doesn't it? But a 1-to-1 ratio isn't even close to good enough to warrant hurting anyone, right? And his prediction that it would help Kim doesn't take into account that Kim might find out. It could have been predicted that Kim would not want to retain Mesa Verde as a client under these fraudulent circumstances, and we see how she reacts when she finds out. It needs to be noted that Jimmy is helping himself with this sabotage too, because he's very worried that without Mesa Verde as a client, Kim will not be able to pay her half of the rent of the expensive offices they're about to sign a lease for. He literally decides to sabotage Chuck right after the scene where Kim's on the verge of backing out of their shared lease. It would destroy Jimmy at this point to lose the sense of connection and legitimacy he's felt from being in a professional partnership with Kim. His initial decision to mess with Chuck's filing seems impulsive. He realizes his brother is non-responsive, he sees the Mesa Verde folders, and he gets to work. What's strange is that just before, he convinced Kim to still sign their expensive lease for the office space by saying,
"Hey, there will be other Mesa Verdes."
Arguably, he didn't need to sabotage Chuck to keep the office. However, a key part of him convincing Kim was saying that he would help, just like she would help him if he was in trouble.
That's why we're a team. Something like this happens. You're there to help me. I'm there to help you.
It's very likely that he's not financially able to do this. I mean, if just based on that expression. I mean, he just intentionally got himself fired at Davis and Maine, and he got to keep the bonus, but that money runs out pretty quick when you're paying monthly for expensive office space. In addition to the ways his actions help himself, there's also the fact that he's upset with his brother for going into the HHM offices and exposing himself to the electricity that affects him so much just to convince Mesa Verde not to leave HHM with Kim. So among the many reasons for Jimmy's actions, revenge is certainly up there, and we're going to come back to the theme of revenge because it's arguably a central theme of the whole show.
Revenge.
But I don't think Jimmy messed with the filing primarily to hurt Chuck, either out of revenge or animosity. I think his judgment gets so clouded that he was genuinely surprised when Chuck said,
"Yesterday morning was the worst professional humiliation of my life."
I do believe Jimmy did it primarily to help Kim and to help himself get a nice office he gets to share with her. To get back to the point about how issues with prediction complicate real-life ethical decision-making, a key fact is that this situation gets completely out of hand for Jimmy and results in events he certainly never predicted. This doesn't remove responsibility from him at all, of course, since he didn't predict the course of events largely because he didn't care enough to try. It wasn't until Kim implied it that he realized he'd have to bribe the guy at the printing and copying store to lie for him. Making someone lie for you is unethical unless there's an extremely good reason, a reason much better than to avoid you having to face consequences for your actions. For example, if you ask your sibling to lie to your parents about you being gay because you have a justified reason to think your parents will react abusively, this is justified. But paying a stranger to lie to your brother so you don't get caught sabotaging him is of course not justified. It's a means to Jimmy's end of preventing Chuck from getting definitive proof of the behavior he already correctly accused Jimmy of. Look, if Chuck was some evil person who was going to murder Jimmy if he found out what Jimmy did, then I would not be here telling you it was unethical of Jimmy to bribe this guy to lie for him. The reality is, however, that Chuck was trying to get Jimmy to face consequences for his actions, like having his law license suspended. Because Better Call Saul shows us such an intimate view of Jimmy's world, however, we as viewers might have mixed feelings about whether we want Jimmy to face even this more just consequence. Not that it ever would have stopped him, but Jimmy could have easily predicted he would have to make this guy lie for him. What he maybe couldn't have predicted is that Chuck would fall and hit his head while questioning the guy at the copy and printer store in one of the most disturbing moments of the series. I mean, Jimmy could potentially have predicted this, since Chuck investigating him would necessarily lead him to this store where he would have to cope with the immense stress of uncountable electronic devices aimed at him. Would Jimmy have still sabotaged his brother if he knew it would lead to Chuck being hospitalized with a head injury? Let me know what you think in the comments. We don't know, but this helps explain why making ethical decisions purely based on expected consequences is deeply fraught with issues, and why we need principles when we're making decisions. Principles such as, it's wrong to sabotage my brother so my partner can keep a client and so we can keep our office. Of course, there may be instances where sabotaging someone or something would be justified, but our principles should tell us this is not one of those situations, because the only harm at risk of being done is harm to Kim's business and to Jimmy's work environment, harm that doesn't rise to a level that would justify sabotage. Especially since Kim losing Mesa Verde as a client is actually not really unfair to her at all, despite what Jimmy thinks.
Kim deserves Mesa Verde, not you, not HHM. She earned it and she needs it.
Yes, she brought them on as a client, but it's ultimately their decision who they want to work with. Plus, when Chuck convinces them to stay with HHM, we as viewers are kinda convinced as well. The way he uses reverse psychology in this scene is just immaculate.
These days, the penalties for even the most honest of errors can be devastating. You need a sharp, young eye to catch that stuff. When you've specialized in this kind of work for decades on end, you tend to get kind of
Stale.
You get stale.
Just amazing stuff. All this is to say, Jimmy's actions are rooted in naive and rosy expectations of the consequences rather than ethical principles. He's not righting any wrongs, he's just trying to get what he wants. So after Chuck is hospitalized with the head injury he gets investigating Jimmy's lies, he devises a plan even more calculated and manipulative than his brother's. He pretends to quit HHM and significantly plays up the symptoms of his issue with electromagnetic waves. graves, telling Jimmy he just can't trust his brain anymore because of the error he made with the Mesa Verde filing. What is so important to note here is that Chuck's plan to get Jimmy to confess does not work at all without one essential element: Jimmy's good nature. If Jimmy was unethical to the core, why would it matter to him to see his brother recede from the world as a consequence of Jimmy's actions? Chuck knows him so well that he can use Jimmy's good side to admit to Jimmy's bad side. When Jimmy admits what he did, we see a perfect example of how issues with foresight can influence unethical decisions.
I did it to help her, but I honestly didn't think it would hurt you so bad. I thought you'd just say, oh crap, I made a mistake, and go on with your life like a normal person. But oh no, wishful thinking!
In the middle of this scene where Chuck is playing Jimmy like a fiddle because he knows him so well, that line from Jimmy feels shockingly out of touch with who his brother is. Of course, Chuck was going to go bananas being professionally humiliated as he just gets going returning to work from a very long medical leave. But we know that Jimmy isn't stupid. He knows his brother very well too. He just gets blinded by his impulsive opportunism. Notably, Jimmy is not ethical to the extreme where he'd be okay actually facing consequences for his actions. He's simply comfortable admitting to Chuck what he did to get Chuck to stop giving up on his own brain.
Besides, it's your word against mine.
Jimmy admitting what he did probably shouldn't be considered ethical in the strictest sense because he's doing a good thing only to cover up what appears to be the tragic negative consequences of his earlier actions. But Chuck certainly isn't always the paragon of virtue either. Even though Chuck's famous for his discipline and judgment, he may be better at performing legality than he is at performing morality. For a significant example of this, let's look at a flashback to 3 years earlier when Chuck and Jimmy are at their mother's hospital bedside as she lays in a coma. This is a scene the show wants us to think about while watching Chuck trick Jimmy into confessing, and we know this because it's a flashback that starts this same episode, the last one of the second season. In the flashback, we see them both sitting by their mother's bedside, and Jimmy gets up to go get sandwiches for both of them because they've been sitting there a while, and also because Chuck is being extremely cold to him. As Jimmy's gone, their mother passes away, but before she does, she actually becomes conscious, shockingly, wakes up and says one thing.
Jimmy.
No, Mom, it's me, Chuck.
Jimmy.
No, Mom, it's me.
It gives me chills every time I watch it, and the way that the show lets the droning beeping sound go on for way too long is just so moving and painful. Jimmy soon gets back with his sandwiches and Chuck tells him their mother has passed. Then this exchange happens.
Did she wake up? Did she say anything?
No.
Now, there is a lot more to unpack in this scene, but let's just focus for now on this point alone. The fact that Chuck lied to his brother, withholding something of immeasurable sentimental value. What do we take away from this? Well, let's talk about people. Sometimes I like to look at a person as having a bunch of drives, some of which are integrated in parts of the self, and some of which are getting in the way of the self as it identifies. In psychological terms, these could be called ego-syntonic drives and ego-dystonic drives. Syntonic, like a harmonious tone, or dystonic, like a discordant tone. Like Jimmy sees himself as clever and charming, both of which he definitely is. These are drives he experiences syntonically. They work with who he sees himself as. But he's also short-sighted and deceitful, tendencies which work against how he views himself. They're dystonic drives. In a similar way, we could describe Chuck seeing himself as attentive and objectively correct, and so on, but he's also got a strong repressed and antisocial streak that affects his course of action. There is no principle in the world that justifies lying to Jimmy in this circumstance, and the fact that Chuck does this reveals a twisted, irrational kernel at the center of his morality. If we rewind the scene to the beginning, after Chuck says no to Jimmy a few times when he suggests they get food, Jimmy recalls a memory involving their mom, and Chuck's response really shows how they experienced their shared world from completely different perspectives.
Remember that time I accidentally invited Kathy and Cheryl to Mom's surprise party. It's kind of tricky out on the dance floor. It was a fun night.
I just remember the whole family cleaning up after you. And Mom leaving her own birthday party to drive one of them home.
So I guess Jimmy caused a lot of trouble or whatever back then, but still, this is not the time to make him feel bad about it, and this is just one of the many situations where we see Chuck's deeply antisocial orientation. But what makes me say that Chuck's antisocial behavior comes from dystonic drives rather than syntonic ones, what makes me say he doesn't want to be a jerk, is that as we see in this scene right after Jimmy leaves to get them sandwiches, Chuck breaks out in tears. Surely this is the only time we see him cry in the entire series, right? I can't remember any other time. We could take it as just the raw pain of losing his mother, but to me it certainly comes across as the frustration of not being able to get over his cold tendencies towards his brother, and his inability to consistently show love to Jimmy. The emotion comes bursting out because he doesn't know how to let it out slowly and consistently. His crying is what wakes up his mother, actually. But as she passes, Chuck snaps immediately from the vulnerability of his crying to the uptight defensiveness that is his response to feeling hurt that his mother didn't call for him. I don't want to get off topic going into detail about this, but the whole Jimmy and Chuck brother rivalry kind of has a biblical feel to it, doesn't it? It reminded me of the story from Genesis of the brothers Jacob and Esau, where the one brother tricks their dying parent to bless him instead of his brother. Here it's similar. Chuck is essentially stealing a sort of blessing from Jimmy. I mean, it's not really a blessing, but it's something like that. Or should we speculate that Chuck kept this from Jimmy because it would hurt him to know his mother woke from a coma to call for him with her last breath when he was getting sandwiches? I don't know about that. It's hard to see good intentions here. I think the ethical thing to do would still be to tell the person, especially when they ask directly like Jimmy did.
Did she wake up? Did she say anything?
With scenes like this, Better Call Saul makes us empathize with Jimmy. Chuck has always been the symbol of law and success, but he's frankly a jerk.
Could be a real son of a bitch.
I just want to say this actor really nailed that smile. I love that smile. I used it in the first video too. And subscribe to see if I use it in the next video. Anyway, Chuck can't speak Jimmy's language of sociability any more than Jimmy can speak Chuck's language of rules. We see this in the situations where Chuck tries to make jokes or be entertaining. For example, in another flashback when Chuck and his wife at the time, Rebecca, had Jimmy over for dinner a week after he moved to Albuquerque and started in the mailroom at HHM. In this scene, we learn that Jimmy didn't make it to their wedding, actually, but more to our point, we see Jimmy cracking Rebecca up with lawyer jokes. He does like a whole routine.
How many lawyers does it take to change a light bulb? Classic setup here. 3. 1 to climb the ladder, 1 to shake it, and 1 to sue the ladder company.
Comedy gold.
She enjoys it, but Chuck doesn't. He doesn't have much of a sense of humor about his profession. He tries to get in on the fun later, though, and he makes a joke, but she's so surprised by it that she doesn't even realize he's making a joke and just gives like a courtesy chuckle to be polite when she realizes. This leads to Chuck having an existential moment of reflection, thinking, I can't do what Jimmy does. He's better than me at this. It's a real hello darkness, my old friend moment where Chuck feels unable to burst out of the confines of his rigid bearing and rigid form of connection with others. To get back to how this impacts his moral decision making, let's talk about another scene with Rebecca, Chuck, and Jimmy. Halfway through the 3rd season, an episode opens with a flashback taking place shortly after Jimmy became a lawyer. By this point, Chuck and Rebecca have divorced, and Chuck's electromagnetic physical/mental health issue has developed. Which, by the way, I don't think that this is a coincidence that this happens after his divorce. In this scene, Chuck is having Jimmy help him set up his house for a dinner with Rebecca to make it look like the power being out is a romantic, quaint thing rather than a serious, debilitating issue. But we see Jimmy warn his brother.
Chuck, you sure this is the right play? I mean, in my experience, the bigger the lie, the harder it can be to dig out.
I'll cross that bridge when I come to it.
But Chuck is very much set on his plan of lying to Rebecca. During the dinner, her phone rings, and soon enough, Chuck is fully triggered and is freaking out. Instead of him being honest and vulnerable, he says,
It is incredibly bad manners to answer a cell phone in company. It's very rude.
Even though he likes to think of himself as a principled man, it's easier for him to lie and be a jerk than to be honest when it means being vulnerable. Being vulnerable is something him and Jimmy both struggle with, and it's tragic that they can't connect about it with each other since that itself would require being vulnerable. But Jimmy covers his vulnerability with extreme sociability, whereas Chuck covers it with anti-sociability. I want to also make the point that Chuck's unwillingness to admit to Rebecca what he's going through indicates that he isn't fully confident it's a physical issue. In my experience as a therapist, people are often much more comfortable opening up about things when they think of it as a physical issue rather than a mental health issue. I think this is related to internalized stigma against mental health issues and internalized conceptions of people as weak or lesser than when they experience debilitations that have mental aspects. To me, this goes back to old-fashioned and outdated perspectives on willpower, some of these perspectives coming from religious orientations, in my opinion, and some people thinking we should have the willpower to change anything that's going on in our minds, where we would never expect the same from physical health issues. This is sort of like the dark side of the mind over matter mentality. It makes people blame themselves more when they're struggling with a mental health issue than they would if they were struggling with a physical health issue, and it is often an obstacle to healing. Later, we get further confirmation that Chuck equates the possibility of his issue being non-physical with an assumption of blame on his part when he's meeting with the doctor he starts working with.
If it's not real, then what have I done?
I want to save a lot of the discussion of Chuck's health issue for the next part in this series because much of it doesn't directly relate to ethics, so we'll go into more detail in part 3 about that, as we also will be digging into the mental health related aspects of Jimmy and Kim's relationship. For now, let's leave it at the observation that Chuck's antisocial behavior and unethical lying to Rebecca is motivated by a severe aversion to vulnerability, and his lying to Jimmy about their mother's last words is also an aversion to vulnerability, while maybe being more predominantly an action based in jealousy, animosity, and revenge. Revenge, okay? So let's talk about revenge. Revenge brings up an important subject. Mike Ehrmantraut. We need to give this man his due time. He is a fantastic character, played by the astoundingly talented Jonathan Banks, an actor who represents the peak of this show's gritty, deep-voiced actors.
Lawyer.
Like Jimmy, Mike moved to Al right before his son Matt was killed. Mike was actually helping him through an ethical conflict at work. Matt's partner and supervisor were quote-unquote dirty cops. They were getting kickbacks from drug dealers, profiting from breaking the law and their oaths to serve their community. They offered to cut Matt in on it, but he didn't know what to do because he felt it was wrong to get kickbacks from criminal actions as he served as a law enforcement officer. He talked to his dad since Mike had been a cop for 3 decades and since he and his dad were very close, and Mike gave him practical advice as we see him explain to Stacy, Matt's widow and Mike's daughter-in-law.
Take the money. Do something good with it.
Mike deeply felt that if his son did anything besides take the money, he was putting his life at risk, since the other cops would view him as a liability to report their behavior. But Mike did not have an easy time convincing in his time as a cop.
He put me up on a pedestal. And I had to show him that I was down in the gutter with the rest of them.
Mike feels significant guilt and shame about convincing his son to take the money, especially because it didn't even work and the other cops murdered Matt anyway. As we watch this, we're left wondering, but what else was Mike supposed to do? Was it really unethical to convince his son to accept illegal bribes when the alternative was that Matt could immediately be a target at serious risk of harm? Better to be guilty and alive than dead and innocent, especially when you have immediate family who needs you. Who wouldn't flip the switch like Mike did in this trolley problem? On the one track, you have Matt's moral framework being dirtied, his respect for his father being decreased, and him contributing to a status quo of accepting bribes from drug dealers. But on the other track, you have Matt being dead and his family being without him. It's clear what the better choice is, but here we run into the same principle from before, which is in real life trolley problems, problems of prediction complicate clear decision making. Because as it would turn out, the two tracks ended up merging anyway.
And the bastards killed him anyway.
So Mike ended up with the worst of both worlds and feels horrible about it, even though arguably he made the most ethical choice possible in this situation. Or maybe this isn't true. I mean, Mike tells Stacy that reporting the dirty cops was not an option because they would kill Matt for doing that, but it's not 100% clear to me that we can trust Mike here as a perfectly reliable narrator. After all, he was wrong about his prediction of how the cops would react to Matt taking the money, so it's possible he would have been wrong about how they'd have reacted to Matt reporting them. Is it totally impossible that Matt could have found a way to report them while maintaining his own safety? We'll never know. Would it have been more ethical for Mike to tell Matt to do whatever he thinks is right and for Mike to support him and help him make his own decision instead of telling him he needed to deal with the situation like Mike had when he was a cop? That would have certainly been more fitting to the ethical principle of self-determination, an extremely important principle that maybe shouldn't overpower the principle of harm reduction, but with the benefit of hindsight, it's not clear that it was right for Mike to be as forceful as he was in telling his son what to do. His honesty to his son about his quote-unquote dirtiness as a cop was admirable, I suppose, but it wasn't strictly ethical because it was a means to an end, a way to convince Matt to do what Mike thought was best. Mike could have still told his son that he had been a dirty cop while being more understanding about Matt's right to do what he thought was best. Mike could have told him that he was at serious risk of harm if he didn't take the money without trying to force him to take it. But at the end of the day, none of this is an indictment on Mike's ethics as much as it's a demonstration of the issues inherent in making ethical decisions primarily based on expected consequences rather than on principles. I would never expect someone in Mike's position to act perfectly rationally. You're on the phone with your son who might make a decision that could get him killed. You're going to be forceful about your opinion. It is inhuman to be able to detach and step back in a situation like that, to say, okay, Matt, do whatever you think's best. And also, we need to acknowledge that Matt was in fact an adult and made his own decision at the end of the day. We can't really blame Mike for Matt's decision, though he does seem to blame himself. And now we need to talk about what happened after Matt was murdered. Less than 6 months after he was killed, his killers, Hoffman and Fenske, were killed, as we structure. Like in the 5 seasons that have come out so far, we get 5 flash forwards to Gene Takovic's life in hiding as a Cinnabon manager, and each is the first scene of each season. I love when art sticks to rules and patterns like this, since I think limitations can be kind of beautiful in like a ritualistic way. And as far as the flashbacks, they come at the start of episodes often. Not every episode starts with a flashback, but many do. And in fact, this episode we've been zoned in on does start with a flashback. This is a more extreme, but still very similar type of ethical conflict to what we were just discussing. It's harm reduction versus self-determination. The situations where it's ethical to override someone's self-determination are very limited, and these cops flipping the switch of the trolley tracks here to sort of put Mike out of his misery is clearly just self-serving rather than stemming from any genuine estimation of the pain Mike might experience living on and struggling with alcohol dependence. It's already obvious that what these cops are doing is wrong, of course. I'm just explaining it because the pattern of ethical reasoning is an interesting one for our discussion. Now let's talk about Mike's decision to kill them. As we've made clear, he kills them in self-defense because they were going to kill him, and we see him break into their car earlier, seemingly to both plant an extra gun for himself. He instead tracked them down to kill them. Would that be wrong? I've always been against the death penalty because I don't support a government killing people for any reason. Also, there are mistakes that are made in this process all the time, and not all relatives of victims even want the perpetrator to be killed. If someone killed a family member of mine, I'm not sure what I would do. If someone killed me, though, I wouldn't want my family members to kill them because that sounds like a lot of work, and I would want them to just mourn my loss in healthy ways. I don't think revenge murder is healthy, and I don't think it's the only form of closure or the best form of closure, but my understanding of the social contracts we all live within is such that a person surrenders their right to not be murdered when they murder someone. Not that I think murderers technically deserve to die, but that their right to life is not clearly superior to the right of a victim's relatives to avenge their relative's death. But the problem is, who is that avenging really for? Who does it serve? You could say that Mike is preventing Hoffman and Fenske from hurting more people, but we can't justify murder by assuming that, and that's not Mike's purpose at all. Does him killing them help Matt? Does it help Stacy? I said that if someone killed a relative of mine, I don't know what I'd do, but if I think about it more, it's very hard to imagine actually killing anyone, not just because I'm a peaceful guy, but also because I don't think my relatives would want me to avenge their death like that. They would want me to press charges against the person and do whatever I can to bring that person to justice, but I don't think anyone I know would want me to execute that justice myself. And as far as I'm aware, Mike has no reason to think Matt would want him to avenge his death. Mike doesn't feel guilt about it though, and I don't know that he should. Why should Mike be held back by an ethical framework that Hoffman and Fensky have already discarded? All of this is moot because he killed them in self-defense, sort of, but we're still considering the hypothetical where it was pure revenge, not in self-defense. It's worth considering this hypothetical at length, especially because, yeah, this is the question you have to ask yourself. I'm not telling you the answer is yes, I'm just acknowledging that this is the question I've made you have to face. The fact that Mike is in acceptance of his lack of control here is made clear in the cinematographically beautiful first scene of the next episode.
If I were to guess, I'd say she wouldn't tell you much. Either way, that's up to her. That's the least I owe her.
Compare that to Jimmy admitting to Chuck that he sabotaged the Mesa Verde filing, but saying it's your word against mine, and not accepting that he owes the person he wronged the ability to make the decision on their own about what they'll do with the information presented. It's very possible Mike feels he owes Stacy not because he murdered Hoffman and Fensky and forced her to lie about it and live with it, but rather because he feels that Mike has learned to accept that he can't control what his loved ones do, after we learn in so much detail about how he tried so hard to influence what Matt did when presented with the ethical quandary at work. And let's ask, assuming we're right to suppose that Mike feels responsible for Matt dying, why would this be? Though he may have been forceful in his influence, he was obviously giving practical advice that he had every reason to think would keep his son as safe as possible. So my thinking is that Mike feels responsible for Matt dying because he influenced him to become a police officer in the first place. Your dad being a cop for 30 years has some influence for sure, but we don't have to speculate because Mike said how Matt put him on a pedestal, and anytime we hear about their relationship, it's about how close they were.
He knew he could call you anytime he had a problem. You were thick as thieves, the two of you.
Whether it's justified or not, many people would feel responsible if their child died at a job that they had in any way influenced them to pursue. And it's not just jobs in general, but being a cop in particular, since a huge part of Mike's character is that he has lost faith in the US judicial system. In the first episode of the whole series, and in the scene where him and Jimmy meet, we get this gem.
Oh, gee, that's swell. And thank you for restoring my faith in the judicial system.
Maybe rather than saying Mike feels bad he influenced you and others from Philadelphia eventually come to New Mexico to interrogate Mike, the older one of the pair is his old friend and knows what Mike did but doesn't plan to act on it. His younger partner very much wants to act on it and is the one interrogating him harshly.
Hopefully whatever you are didn't rub off on the rest of your family.
So even though the guy said that to Mike, Mike acknowledges to his old friend that that type of attitude is an improvement to the corruption of the older cops.
Like the kid.
Yeah. He's all right.
We don't see Mike disagree here, and I think it's probably because the young guy reminds him of Matt, but that's just my speculation. I want to add one more point about the Flash. Stacy doesn't be able to trust him, especially once he's finally honest at the end of the episode after passing through the denial and anger. A big difference between Mike and Jimmy is Mike is more often accepting of the idea that he may have to face consequences. Not that he's going to confess to the cops what he did and send himself to jail, but lying to the police is illegal, not necessarily unethical, because the state's application of justice is by no means automatically what justice is. But here, Mike accepts that he may die in prison if Stacy decides to tell the police what he told her, whereas Jimmy can't even accept that he may lose his law license maybe temporarily if Chuck turns him in. These relationships are very different, as we see Chuck actually leverage the law to hold Jimmy accountable because he finds it the right thing to do for pretty good reasons. I did a poll on my YouTube channel and the vast majority of people seem to consider Jimmy unethical, but we don't necessarily watch the show wanting him to face consequences for that though. Maybe a little bit, I mean certainly more than we want Mike to face consequences, right? No one watches and wants Stacy to talk to the cops. Mike draws an ethical line sooner than Jimmy in terms of what amount of lying and other unethical behaviors he'll engage in to avoid consequences. Mike's more mature acceptance of consequences comes from his more well-developed understanding of their 2-day near-death trek through the desert. If we were hoping for a trauma bond to form between them in the desert, we didn't really get it, but we did see some of the most moving scenes in their desperation to get home safely while lugging $7 million in cash. Jimmy's previous... that's not his name anymore.
Saul Goodman, speedy justice for you.
Saul's previous affiliation with Nacho Varga gets him a new client it doesn't seem like he can really say no to. Lalo Salamanca under the name Jorge de Guzman, who has been caught after he murdered someone while tracking Fring and Mike's escaped employee Werner Ziegler. It would have been hard for Saul to say no to Nacho here, but when he goes and meets with Lalo the first time, we see him have the chance to not work with him, but he changes his mind for the money and because Lalo sort of makes him feel like he's kind of a loser if he doesn't help him. So he helps an unapologetic murderer, and if he didn't have a ton of choice in the situation now, which I think he had a little, but if he didn't, that doesn't necessarily mean it isn't his responsibility that he's in this situation in the first place, since back when he was Jimmy in the first few episodes of the first season, he got himself entangled with Nacho due to his own decisions. But let's get back to the work that actually makes her feel fulfilled. Saul is upset, not understanding Kim's non-opportunist. Notice whether you hear him say good or bad.
Sometimes those choices seem small, but they put you on the road. You think about getting off, but eventually you're back on it.
Moralizing, he was emphasizing our ability for choice and the necessity of facing the chain of events that come from our choices. Mike seemed to be saying to Saul, yes, we have these consequences, but it's because of the free will that got us here. But what Saul says to Kim is more like, yes, we have free will, so don't you want to avoid consequences? He's using the philosophy as a means to control Kim to be more opportunistic, rather than accepting the philosophy's intended purpose, which is being an acceptance of the consequences of your past actions. In fact, if Saul had really understood the advice, he'd view Kim making a decision he disagreed with in a more accepting light, and he'd understand that it's her choice and her responsibility to face whatever consequences come from her decision. He would also realize that he made the decision to be with her, to marry her as well, and needs to accept as a consequence of that she may make decisions he doesn't agree with. I keep talking about opportunism, and since who cares if this video goes on forever, I want to focus in on what I mean by that. First, let's say something about Mike's late son Matt, who represents the opposite of opportunism. Matt's inability to adapt to the corruption of his environment is what singled him out as a target. Whether or not it's true that conventional success requires opportunism, corruption, and unethical behavior, many people feel that it does, and this is a question Better Call Saul forces us to ask ourselves. Not even just in the quote-unquote criminal justice environment, but also in the business environment, as we hear when Jimmy talks to Marco in a Season 3 flashback about why his dad couldn't succeed in business.
He could have made it work. He could have sold beer and cigarettes to the kids from Mary Margaret's, but oh no, not him. He's never going to do what he had to do.
Whether or not he's right, Jimmy perceives unethical behavior as necessary to success, and since he's the protagonist, it's a question the show asks us to struggle with throughout. When he doesn't have a law license in Season 4 and he's selling drop phones on the street, he gets robbed by some young guys, potentially kids, high school age looking.
Very good to meet you boys. Good luck with the Junior Achievement Project. I gotta go. Hey!
They beat him up and steal his money, but soon he goes back to the same place, unable to let go of his plan he hatched to upsell the phones from his job to people on the street. We see him approaching the same kids and act like he's going to cut them in. Instead, Jimmy has a bigger plan in mind, and he runs away and lets them chase him to a spot where 2 guys he hired kidnaps them. Jimmy traumatizes these kids with fear of death or serious bodily harm, not just as revenge for them robbing him, but even more so to secure his ability to do business on those streets without being robbed by them at the end of each night.
You get one warning, and that was it.
He's willing to engage in this highly unethical behavior for the money and for the cool feeling he gets from using his sales skills on the streets. In the Gene Takovic flash forward of Season 5, Episode 1, we see someone dox him as Saul Goodman when he's taken on a new identity, and the scene ends with Gene saying,
I'm gonna fix it myself.
Well, we will see how that goes on April 18th in the very first scene. So, yeah. After all, if you're willing to kidnap high schoolers or people who seem like high schoolers so you can sell phones on the street, why not be willing to kill someone for the much more serious opportunity of avoiding having your cover blown on your fake identity? Oh, it's wrong to kidnap anyone, not just high schoolers, I should say. But anyways, it's not ethical, but it follows from the logic of his ethics that he's willing to do worse and worse things to preserve his own opportunities. And what the show wants us to do is compare such behavior of Jimmy to, say, Fring's decision to kidnap Nacho in Season 5 and threaten to kill his father in front of him to get Nacho to spy on Lalo for him. Is Fring's opportunism any more unethical than Jimmy's? We learn in Season 5 how Fring supports a whole community in Mexico, which we find out when he sends Mike there to recover and get medical assistance after Mike is beaten up by different people on the street. Fring finances the whole town. He is, as Mike puts it,
the anonymous benefactor.
In addition to being a beautifully staged scene, this is an important one for digging into the ethical framework of Fring. Mike gives him his 2 cents.
Well, that must make you feel pretty good. And is that supposed to balance the scales? Make up for everything else you do?
It makes up for nothing. I am what I am.
Fring refuses to attempt some twisted utilitarian logic. He wants to win the territory war he's waging with the Salamancas, and he doesn't need to lie to himself that it's moral. Mike's specific criticism that Fring is playing some denial-based utilitarian numbers game with his morality, this echoes a criticism from a few episodes earlier when Everett Acker says this to Kim when she tries to convince him to move off of his land so her bank client can build a call center there.
You're one of those people that give a little money to charity every month so you can make up for all the bad that you've done.
I don't know that this is necessarily true about Kim, honestly, but it probably is part of her motivation to make public defense her full-time work at the end of the 5th season. What Acker's criticism and Mike's criticism communicates is that ethical behavior requires consistency. It's not a math equation that balances out. It's a waveform that requires continuity. Without sustained attention to principles, you're just doing opportunism plus denial. Both Kim and Fring are each too smart to live in denial, so they do what they can to carry on. Kim by actually turning to full-time public defense work, and Fring by saying, I am what I am, and pursuing his business in full awareness of the harm he causes. And yet he is not okay with Mike implying there's a moral equivalence between him and the Salamancas.
You know better. You have met them. You know what they are.
Meaning the Salamancas. And you are so very different from them?
Yes. I am different.
It's very interesting to me that Mike doesn't ask why here. The show doesn't want Fring to explain in detail his rationality. We're supposed to think it through for ourselves. It may be true that the Salamancas kill more people unnecessarily than Fring does. I'm not sure, but that could be true. But one major difference between them is that Fring is more intertwined with civil, non-criminal society. He runs a legitimate chicken business, he supports that town in Mexico, he works with a big corporation, Madrigal, to launder his money. It's not clear to me that any of this makes him any more ethical than Hector Salamanca, but it does make him someone to whom drug dealing is a business rather than a lifestyle, so he doesn't kill people for fun like Hector, Lalo, and Tuco might. Mike and Fring move on to talking about why Fring wants Mike specifically to work for him so much, and this is when we get the line that we referenced way earlier in the video.
Why me?
Because I believe that you understand.
Understand what?
Revenge.
Mike does very much seem to have a choice here, but I'm actually not sure, honestly, because it seems like we're to understand that Mike agrees to help Fring because Fring's reference to revenge made sense to him and won him over, but I'm wondering whether this is because Mike respects and understands Fring's desire for revenge, or rather because Fring's mention of revenge is implicitly saying, I know what you did and I can ruin your life for it. I genuinely can't tell, and this might be me being stupid, so let me know how you interpreted this in the comments. I don't know if the show is implying that Fring is threatening this, so yeah, that would make it not really a choice for Mike after all. But that would be pretty interesting then if Fring had made these previous moral claims about himself if he wasn't even trying to convince Mike for any moral reason, but rather just from force. Anyway, we see in the next episode Mike gets some new information about the morality of his boss.
You know who you're working for, right? The shit that this guy does. They shot me, left me bleeding out in the desert, all part of some plan.
Nacho goes on to add,
He's got a gun to my father's head.
This certainly impacts Mike, whose two big things are he doesn't like shooting people and he doesn't like people who aren't part of the game being brought into it, both of which we can understand for very obvious reasons why these are two of his most significant hang-ups. Sadly, his choices lead him to situations where keeping to his principles would be self-destructive, leading to the ultimate tragedy of him murdering Werner Ziegler in a scene so darkly moving that I'm not even going to say anything more about it because it's just too perfect. What I will say more about is how Mike responds to Kai when Kai tries to justify to Mike what Mike did in a clip we saw in the intro of our video today.
It had to be done. He was a good man, but in truth, he was soft.
Mike knows that there is no justification for killing Ziegler. When he killed Werner, he flipped the trolley from a track where he died to a track where Werner died. And that is a selfish decision, not an ethical one. To contrast with his reaction to Kai's misguided support, look at the feedback Mike receives from the next German worker and look at how he responds.
He was worth 50 of you.
In a less interesting show, it would be this German worker that would get hit instead of Kai, but Mike is much wiser and more complex than that. Whether or not it's literally true that Werner was worth 50 Mikes, the truth of that statement is that Mike's life is not worth more than Werner's, and saving himself by killing Werner was not justified. It is a far greater insult to Mike for someone like Kai to imply that what he did was justified. Mike doesn't want to moralize and lie to himself. A sign of being an adult is liking taking responsibility, even if it makes you feel bad and guilty. Unfortunately, this is something both Jimmy and Saul really struggle with, and it prevents him from maturing. I think now, after all this time of talking, I can finally get to the question of how ethical considerations factor into whether Jimmy is capable of change. The answer is obviously that everyone is capable of change, but we must add that Jimmy and Saul haven't demonstrated any ability to change yet. This reminds me of the Kafka quote, "Believing in progress does not mean believing that any progress has yet been made." From season 1 through 5, any ethical behaviors Jimmy or Saul have engaged in have been followed by unethical behaviors. In his relationship with Kim, which we'll go into much more in depth in the next video in this series, Jimmy/Saul shows occasional moments of guilt about the scams they do together, but he still does them. And speaking of things he still does, even deep into season 3, we saw that Slippin' Jimmy was still alive and well. His persona from decades earlier had a full-on resurrection in the episode with the subtle title Slip. He's selling ad time to businesses because he had a bunch of time left over after he lost his law license and couldn't run the ads for his legal services that he had already purchased airtime for. He's not allowed by contract to resell the ad time, so he devised a plan to sell commercial production services to businesses and throw in the ad time for free. I can't knock the creative grind, and I know he's desperately afraid of not being able to pay his half of the rent of the office space he and Kim are still sharing. But when he gets a business interested and then they back out, he definitely crosses the line.
Are you okay?
It was a drumstick. It was laying loose in the aisle.
This is to get a payoff from the business owners. They buy his ad time and give him a guitar, apparently. But he knows he's done something wrong, so he lies to Kim. He's happy to be able to pay rent, and he gives her an envelope of cash, but his defensive attitude puts them further apart instead of closer together.
So at least we can stop talking about that.
Jimmy, I wasn't...
Just take it so we're square, all right? Okay. Sorry.
This is the same scene we showed a clip from in part 1, where Jimmy says in this gravelly, guilty voice,
I mean, you believe me, right?
Yes.
it's important to him to be trusted, but not that important. Not like first priority important. And as I always like to say, you can only have one first priority. If it isn't your ethical compass, then it's likely your opportunism, and Jimmy hasn't yet shown that he has the emotional stability to show up consistently in his relationships in a way that would build genuine trust. It's fair to say that a small part of Jimmy's unethical behavior throughout the first 5 seasons has been motivated by genuine economic distress, and in some situations his opportunism comes across as understandable given the fact that he's living and working out of a closet-sized room at a nail salon when we meet him. But much of his behavior, from sabotaging Chuck's Mesa Verde filing to scamming the owners of this guitar store, much of this was unnecessary opportunism. The shame of having your partner cover your rent for a few months should be the lesser evil trolley track compared to scamming a local business and lying to that same romantic partner. There is a whole lot more we could and maybe should talk about, but I'm going to be opportunistic myself and hop on the opportunity to finish this video before I get arrested for felony overthinking. Yes, we should go into the whole plot of him trying to get Chuck to cash out at HHM so Jimmy could get some of that money. Yes, we should talk about him manipulating everyone to hate the nice old lady Irene so Jimmy could get a piece of the huge Sandpiper settlement when Irene would decide to settle. Yes, I definitely should talk about Nacho Varga at some point. I love his character, and yes, I even meant to go into how Jimmy did unethical things for ethical reasons sometimes. Like when he scammed people with Marco at the end of season 1 because he feels bad after Marco realizes Jimmy didn't see him when he came to town 3 years prior for his mom's funeral. Maybe Chuck, rest in peace, put it best when he said this.
I love my brother. There's nothing malicious in Jimmy. He has a way of doing the worst things for reasons that sound almost noble.
But it's not always the reasons that matter. It's not always the consequences either. It's always a mix of them both. Okay. That's it. We're done. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you should probably subscribe and check out some of the other videos. I'm also, as I've mentioned a few times, gonna come out with part 3 in this series and probably a part 4. So you're gonna wanna check those out. I don't think I'm gonna drop any more parts in this series before season 6 comes out because it's gonna be out in like a month. Maybe less by the time I finish editing this. And, you know, I kind of want to see what it's like, you know? So I'm really looking forward to checking out season 6, absorbing it with my whole body and soul, and then incorporating it into whatever I have to say next. I already have a bunch planned that I want to say, and I know there's going to be so much that's going to need to be added and changed. So yeah, stick around and stay tuned. If you'd like to support these videos, you can send me a few bucks on Patreon, and you'll also get to check out videos and music there that aren't posted anywhere else. So that's kind of a cool thing. I want to thank the awesome people who support these videos currently. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. You can stop at any time, but thank you. I really appreciate it. So thank you Strawman Productions, Elise, Put My Name in the Credits Winky Face, and a very cool anonymous human being. I really appreciate the support. It really means a lot. Thank you so much. And lastly, if you want to check me out on Twitch, I stream there where I play chess and talk about whatever and just chill out and unwind in the evenings. So come hang out on Twitch. The link's in the description. And yeah, that's pretty much all for today. I hope you have a really good rest of your time on the internet. Okay, bye.
Down in the gutter with the rest of them. Down in the gutter with the rest of them. Down in the gutter with the rest of them. Down in the gutter with the rest of them. I was down in the gutter with the rest of them. Down in the gutter with the rest of them. Down in the gutter with the rest of them. I was down in the gutter with the rest of them. Down in the gutter with the rest of them.